I'm Ann Knigendorf, a writer and editor in the Public Affairs Department of the Kansas City Public Library, and I'm so glad to see you all here tonight. We didn't know what that storm was going to do, so we're glad that you made it. Before we talk about tonight, let's hit on a couple of things we have coming up. This Saturday at 2 at the Central Library, Senator Tim Kaine will discuss his new book called Walk, Ride, and Paddle, A Life Outside with award-winning author Candace Millard. So that's at 2 at Central on Saturday. On Tuesday at 6, also at Central, author and songwriter Alice Randall will talk about her most recent book, My Black Country, a journey through country music's black past, present, and future. Randall is the first black woman to co-write a #1 country hit single, which was Trisha Yearwood's X's and O's. Some of you might remember that one. So something I've known for years and that working at a library has reinforced is that I don't know much about much. So when I received a recent Kansas Humanities mailer detailing events celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, one of my first thoughts was, I've been to the museum in Topeka, but how much do I remember about that court case? What do I really know? So I read further and I saw information about Donna Rae Pearson's talk, The Women of Brown. And I thought, I definitely don't know anything about this, so let's invite her for a visit. Donna Rae is a curator at the Kansas Historic Society in Topeka. She's a historian who focuses on the history of African Americans in Kansas and historic preservation. And she's the co-owner of Other Roads Consulting, which works to make the past relevant through oral histories, grant development and management, and community outreach and public engagement. She was also once the local history librarian at the Topeka and Shawnee County Public Library, where she taught people how to conduct research toward preserving the stories of the Topeka community. Tonight, she'll teach us about the 12 black women who were at the forefront of the civil rights movement as plaintiffs in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case, and how they weren't so much interested in integration as they were in their children having access to the resources their tax dollars were paying for. 70 years after the ruling, so last week was the 70th anniversary, these women are largely forgotten. The lives of women in general, but the lives of black women in particular, were not well documented. Donna had to dig for information, and she mostly found what she was looking for. Please welcome Donna Rae Pearson.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight, because she's right, the weather was a little bit sketchy, so I appreciate you being here. Now, I am going to make a couple of disclaimers before I get into this. I live on the Kansas side, okay? I do. So, well, thank you. So sometimes I will slip and say, are we, or something like that in this presentation. So just know that I'm referring to Kansas. But I explained earlier today, I think this is a very local story that you can connect to very national events, making it a universal story. So even though this story is a Topeka story, I think hopefully you'll be able to find some connections within it for you. So with that, I'm just going to kind of jump right in there and make sure we have enough time for questions, okay? So, you know, for far too long, Brown versus Board of Education case has been remembered as a fight led by men in suits. But the truth is, the case is titled Oliver Brown et al. V. Board of Education of Topeka et al. That et al. Listed after Brown signifies 12 black, seemingly ordinary women living in Topeka, Kansas. They also played a crucial role in the landmark victory. These mothers agreed to be plaintiffs, pushing for equal access to educational opportunities for all black children, not just their own. Today, I will tell you about the case and answer the question, why Kansas, okay? And then I will fill in at least some of the blanks of the lives of these 12 women that were part of what I call the case of the century. So, with that, we're going to wake up the clicker instead before Leslie freaks out back there. Okay. I'm sure this question was asked before it appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and again in the Topeka Capital, December of 1953 editorial. The Topeka Capital characterized the words the editor wrote as pertinent ancient history. He stated that 5 champions of segregation were South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, the District of Columbia, and Kansas. He then implored, why Kansas? A couple of paragraphs into the article, he states, beyond that, however, Kansas was founded as a state on the belief of equal rights. Before the Civil War, the slavery question was fought out in bloody Kansas. The slavery question, no state better symbolized the conviction of the North. Why is Kansas now defending segregation? In the article, an unnamed state official said that the end of legal segregation, it wouldn't change much. That Kansas would abide by the old theory that education might be separate but equal. The Topeka Capital concluded the shades of Governor Robinson and Jim Lane and other Jayhawkers of a century ago would revolt at this theory. It was not why they fought, and that it is questionable whether today's Kansans stood for segregation or had their officials even asked them. Let's remind you how we got the case of the century in our state. Now in our state, Kansas. In 1874, when the Kansas legislature passed the Civil Rights Act prohibiting discrimination on account of race, colored, or previous conditions of servitude that applied to schools and public institutions of all levels, to common carriers, and to places public accommodations, entertainment licensed by municipalities. With this act, it was living up to the promise of bleeding Kansas era. But then in 1879, the largest migration of blacks out of the South happened. Does anyone know what that is? Oh, I heard exodusters somewhere, and you are correct. The reputation Kansas had gained as a place where equal rights were guaranteed attracted some 40,000 blacks to the state between 1879 and 1881. And yes, this migration was called the Exoduster movement. At one point in time, nearly every county in Kansas had a black population. And actually, that's not the case today, but at one point in time we did. In response to this migration, white Kansans did a lot of things. Blacks were provided shelter, they received help locating jobs, and in some places, an education. I do have to mention that there were just as many blacks that came here with their own resources to begin a new life. I currently live in a place called Tennessee Town, and in Tennessee Town, I did a research project, because that's what researchers do for fun, okay? Right? I don't know. And so I looked at the building permits, and for the most part, there were 500 colonists. They came with money and resources to not only buy their land, but to build their houses and start developing a life. And that's not normally what we hear about the Exodusters. We hear the Exodusters were just there looking for a handout. So whenever I can, I like to correct that little myth. At least in Tennessee Town, they came with resources. So when we think about this, the Kansas legislature also responded. It passed a statute specifically allowing first-class cities, those with at least 15,000 or more, to conduct separate elementary schools. The cities that could have what we call permissive segregation were Atchison, Leavenworth, and Topeka. By 1950, this list would grow to 11 cities across the state. So do we see any coincidence in the Exodusters coming and all of a sudden this new law on the books? So, but there's another way we can look at this as well. Looking at what's going on at the national level, by 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the separate but equal doctrine in the United States Supreme Court. Homer Plessy argued segregation on trains violated the federal Constitution's 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause. However, the court ruled 7-1 that separation inherently wasn't unequal if the facilities were equal. So as long as you had a classroom here that had the same resources as the classroom there, you should be fine, right? But does that ever work out, really? Probably not. Now this decision, though, validated racial segregation for decades prior to the Brown case. But even before the Plessy decision, Black Kansans opposed permissive segregation laws. From 1881 to 1951, Black Kansans would file at least 17 cases. 11 cases were Kansas Supreme Court cases, and there are also 6 known lower court cases for the right for their children to attend school with equal resources and opportunities available to white students. So what this map is, another version of the schizophrenia of what I call Kansas education. So what we have here is, remember, this was just at the lower levels, so the universities were integrated, right? And that's the green ones. You see those around. First-class cities with segregation are the blue stars. So sometimes that also actually overlaps the universities, right? So at one point, all of a sudden, you were still integrated, and then humans are such a creative set of beings. Somehow the second and third class cities who had no right to do this figured out how to do this, still have school segregation within there. Now the numbers that you see are the places where there were legal challenges in the public schools. To make this even more complicated, what most people realize, again, these were just in cities that were first class cities. That means if you were in a rural area, you were attending an integrated school. Did y'all catch that? So it just depended on where you were, what your background was, what kind of schooling that you would get in Kansas. Now, that one little yellow heart, that's Hutchinson. That is the only city in the state that could have segregated schools, but decided not to. So we should give Hutch a round of applause, right? To further kind of hone in on the point, this is a map that shows where segregation occurred. Mandatory segregation, of course, you guys I know I'm in Missouri now, so that's where mandatory segregation happened. There are actually places in the country where segregation was totally forbidden. That's the gray. The other purplish colors, that's no school segregation, on the books anyway. That blue number is those blue counties, states always throw me off, because when you look at them, it's like, why? Why did they decide to have some sort of optional segregation on the books? So I think that is an interesting question that I still have not answered. Okay. There we go. All right. So, when answering the question of I have come up with some thoughts though. When answering the question of why Kansas, we do have to consider Jim Crow. Now, you know the words Jim, it's a guy, it's a person, Crow, it's a bird, right? But let's consider the two together as a pair and define them. Now, Jim Crow is based on a minstrel show character, and Jim Crow evolved into a derogatory slang term for Black people. Eventually, it came to mean that any state law passed, especially in the South, that established different rules for Blacks and whites. Jim Crow laws were based on the theory of white supremacy and were a reaction to the Reconstruction period. But y'all, Jim Crow lived a good life in Kansas too, okay? Now, there were probably not any signs hanging in windows talking about who they would not serve. Black people in Kansas would just have to know. You just have to There are just some things you would have to know about how close you could get to whites in Kansas, because Kansas practiced what is called both de jure segregation, as well, which is imposed by law, as well as de facto segregation, which is the practice not required by law. Most of these things can occur in a public space. So some of the things that Jim Crow Kansas, was a challenge for blacks was you couldn't eat with whites, you couldn't try on clothes or shoes in a store, you could not live in white neighborhoods, you could not swim in city pools, you could not go to a white hairdresser, you could not go to a white dentist, you could not sit with white churchgoers, you are not going to be riding in a railroad car with whites, rent an apartment if even one white lived in the building, you are not going to be teaching white children, you are not going to be embalmed by a white undertaker, go to school with whites, or be buried in a cemetery along with whites. Now, as a result of Jim Crowism, it is in these segregated spaces that blacks frequently created their own separate communities that did not rely on contacts with whites. It's in these communities you would find black businesses, black doctors, black nurses, black churches, or black cemeteries. There were the social networks created that gave blacks a space to have discussions and strategize about ways to make their lives better. But things were about to change. World War II put America prominently on the international stage. The link between white supremacy and Hitler's master race theories could not be ignored. Jim Crow shocked the United Nations delegates who reported home about the practice. Racial discrimination furnishes the grist for the communist propaganda mills, said a government spokesperson. It raises doubt even among friendly nations as to the intensity of our devotion to democratic faith. All right, so let's go back in time a little bit. So in 1951, Lucinda Todd most likely sat at her dining room table with a pad of lined paper and a pencil. It was here she began to draft a 4-page press release that stated, "For the Negro Press." Oh, I touched things, my apologies. It stated, "For the Negro Press," next line, "Suit hits separate schools in Kansas," next line, "Topeka, Kansas," next line. "Legal counsel for a group of Negro children who, through their parents, are seeking to enter grade schools located in the area in which they live, have filed an amended complaint in a lawsuit filed in the U.S. District Court, the first Kansas District Court, on February 28th. All of the plaintiffs live here. The statute which gives cities of Kansas the right to establish separate schools is being challenged in this case." From there, she explains the causes, tells who the attorneys are filing the action, and the reasons why they filed a lawsuit. Near the end of the press release, she writes, "Interest in this case is widespread, and some educators are predicting an end to segregation schools in Kansas." She goes on to recall the success of integrating the junior high schools in Topeka that led to the integration of high schools across the state. The suit she is talking about is Oliver Brown et al. V. Board of Education of Topeka et al. It was filed by the Topeka NAACP on February 28, 1951. The plaintiffs were 13 Topeka parents on behalf of their 20 children. The case listed the 13 plaintiffs as Oliver Brown, Darlene Brown, Lena Carper, Sadie Emanuel, Marguerite Emerson, Shirley Fleming, Zelma Henderson, Shirley Hodison, Maud Lawton, Alma Lewis, Iona Richardson, and Lucinda Todd. These Black women are the et al. After Oliver Brown's name. Let's move them to the forefront. Who are they and what did they do? Now, this is where you guys have to indulge me my luxury because I will read their bios to you, okay? And I want you to see them. So, Darlene Brown was born in Crowburg, a mining camp in southeast Kansas in 1926. Brown is the child of Andrew and Magnolia Phelps and is their only offspring. At the time of the case filing in 1951, Brown was a self-employed hairdresser and the youngest adult plaintiff. Her primary connection in the community were to the Baptist Church, where she was a member of Mount Carmel Baptist Church. Brown was involved in various activities at the church, including as choir director, organist, and pianist. She continued to reside in Topeka until her passing in 1997. Lena Carper was born in 1920 to George and Catherine Greer in Hiawatha, Kansas. She grew up and attended school in Hiawatha before relocating to Topeka, where she worked at the NYA Center. She participated in the New Deal work program implemented by Franklin Roosevelt, and it is possible that she met the other plaintiffs that were also participating in this program as well. She married Dorsey Carper in 1940, and during the time of the case, she worked in nursing homes and did housework while Dorsey was the department manager at the Hotel Kansan. Later in life, she worked as a seamstress and a clinical child care worker at the Children's Hospital in Menninger's Foundation until 1983. She played a vital role in forming the Church of God Seventh-day Adventist Church. She spent the rest of her life in Topeka and is buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in 2002. Sadie Emanuel was born in Huntsville, Alabama, to a family of 5 children. She moved to Topeka in 1924 around the age of 8. She married Lawrence Joshua Emanuel sometime before 1940. She had one son, James Meldon, who was 9 at the time of the first trial. Sadie worked part-time as a cook at a local hospital and served as the president of the Washington PTA. And the Washington PTA was actually the largest Black school in Topeka, so that was a state of honor. She was also the choir chair of the church wagon at the Carver YWCA and a member of St. John's AME, where she was a member of the choir. Shirla Fleming was born in a small town of Winfield, Kansas in 1914. She was the 5th child of James and Willa Wilhope. When she was 15 years old, her entire family moved to Topeka. Shirla had 5 sons, 2 of whom were from a previous marriage to Thomas D. Phelps. By 1940, she married Silas H. Fleming Sr., a butcher. Silas H. Jr. was one of the infant plaintiffs in the case. After the Supreme Court case was decided, the family moved to Minnesota. Unfortunately, not much is known about her life there. Shirla passed away in 1968 at approximately the age of 53. Marguerite Emerson was born on September 19, 1919, in Topeka, Kansas, to Fred and Helen Harris. In 1940, she married George Emerson, and he worked for the railroad during the case, but it's unclear what Marguerite's occupation was during the trial, but it is possible her connection to the trial came from her neighbors. She lived in close proximity to plaintiffs Iona Richardson and Lucinda Todd, while their children all attended Buchanan School, which was one of the Black schools. Later in life, Marguerite would work for the state of Kansas, where she retired from. She attended Mount Carmel Missionary Baptist Church along with fellow plaintiff Darlene Brown, where she remained a member until she passed away in 1979. She is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery, and Mount Auburn Cemetery was founded by African American businessmen, so it was considered an all-Black cemetery at the time. Zelma Henderson was born in Colby, Kansas. Zelma Henderson attended integrated schools. When she moved to Topeka in 1940, she was shocked at the level of segregation and could only get a job as a maid. Instead, she attended Kansas Vocational School and later operated a beauty salon out of her home after her marriage. There, she sold NAACP memberships to her clients. Henderson was friend with Topeka NAAC President McKinley Burnett, whom she had known through her mother. She was asked by attorney John Scott to join the case. She did so because I did not want them, her children, to have any type of inferior feeling about the other race. Shirley Hodison was born in 1922 in Indiana. By 1944, she had moved to Topeka and was married to Charles Hodison. They had 5 children, including Charles, who attended Buchanan School at the time of the 1951 filing, where he was 8 years old. Shirley was a housewife and went to live in California, where most of her children resided after the death of her husband. She died there in 1997. Maud Lawton was born in Cowado, Oklahoma in 1907. It is unclear when she arrived in Topeka. At the time the case is filed, she is a housewife living with her family at 1422 Munson. She is a member of the Capital City Community Church of God and entered as a plaintiff on behalf of her daughter, Victoria. Alma Lewis gave us fits, y'all, but Alma Lewis is great. She was born Magdalene Alma Payne in Independence, Kansas, to Richard and Matilda Payne on March 15, 1914. It is unclear when she moved to Topeka, Kansas, but in the 1930 census lists her as a resident of the household of her father. Following her marriage to Charles Lewis in 1932, she decided to go by her middle name of Alma, which is why we could not find her. We kept losing her and finding her and losing her and finding her. Luckily, we got it together. Alma was a member of the First Church of God in Christ, where she may have come to know Iona Richardson. Later, she became a member of Faith Temple Church of God in Christ. She lived in Topeka until her late husband's death in 1992. She then relocated to Portland, Oregon with her children until her death in 1998. Iona Richardson was the 5th child of Wilman and Elizabeth Ware in Wisconsin. Her mother, Elizabeth Martin Ware, was a member of the Stockbridge Indigenous Tribe of Wisconsin. All 8 children, including Iona, belonged to the tribe as well. Her father, William, was a Black American. Iona's husband, James, testified that their son, Ronald, attended a parochial school instead of a segregated public school simply because I do not believe in segregation. Richardson lived a few doors away from the Lucinda Todd house. She attended First Church of God in Christ. At the time of the case, Iona was a homemaker. Later, she worked for Forbes Air Force Supply Depot. She lived in Topeka for the rest of her life until she passed away in 2000. Vivian Scales was born in 1911 to James and Anna Ella Wilhoit. So yes, I'm not repeating that one. They are related. Her family relocated to Topeka in the early 1930s. She is the youngest sister of Shirla. They both were used to going to integrated schools in Winfield before they moved and attended the public schools in Topeka. Vivian married George Scales in 1939 and represented their only child, Ruth Ann, in the case. She remained very active in the community, including the NAACP, where she once stated, "It wasn't easy, but it was something you had to want to do. If you would do anything at all, it would be better." Vivian remained a dedicated member of Antioch Baptist Church until she passed in 2005. She's buried alongside her husband in Mount Hope Cemetery. Lucinda Todd. Lucinda Todd was born in a small coal mining camp called Litchfield, Kansas in 1903. Her parents had been part of the post-war exodus from the South into Kansas. She founded the Citizens Committee on Civil Rights in 1948. Todd wrote a letter to the NAACP branch office of the National Branch Office stating that her daughter did not have equal access to educational opportunities that white children of Topeka had. Todd was the first parent to register as a plaintiff. She held many positions in the Topeka branch of the NAACP. Mrs. Todd passed away in 1996 in Topeka. Thank you. Now, these 12 women represent a range of experiences. They are typical Black women of the 1950s in that they were all married at some point in time during the case, and they obviously all had children. The research team and the research team that I'm referring to is Humanities Kansas. The research team, we received a grant to research these women specifically and to create the exhibit that you see in the back. So we wanted to put together a new image of these women beyond the typical 1950s woman. So to do that, we noticed that most of their husbands had, quote, good jobs for a Black person in Topeka, which means that Darlene and Sadie's husband both worked for the railroad. Shirley and Zelma's husbands worked at a meat factory packing plant. Lena and Shirley's husbands worked at the hospitals. This might have afforded the women a certain amount of status in the community. There's debate about that, but after World War II, most white women returned home after the factory work for the war was done. But Black women were in the workforce before World War II, and they continued to stay in the workforce after that. And by doing so, this is helping their families attain a middle-class status. I do like to point out that at least 3 of them that we could determine, Darlene Brown, Zelma Henderson, and possibly Lena Carper, owned their own businesses or took in work. A couple of them had husbands whose jobs were stable enough that they were actually able to stay home. Now, I find their age range just as fascinating. I always give a shout out to the youngest one, Darlene Brown. She was about 25 years old at the time of the case. And most of the time we don't, well, even today, or maybe I'm getting old. I don't know which one it is, so we'll just go there with that. But 25 years old to sign up for a legal challenge like this, I mean, has to be kind of a remarkable feat, in my opinion. We don't give 25-year-olds credit enough at this point in time, so maybe she is an example of that they actually can do things. The oldest one, you know, and Lucinda Todd is actually my favorite one. When this case started, she was about in her 50s as it was winding its way through the judicial system. So it's kind of like saying it's never too old to start something new, right? So another thing that we found interesting was their educational background. We found that 5 of them were born in rural areas across the state of Kansas. And as I said before, they were most likely attending some sort of integrated schools, whether it be the upper or the lower or upper levels. This would have given them a broader view of what kinds of opportunities could be available for their children. Now, I'm not saying the integrated school was a better school. My father grew up in Wichita, and at this time, yes, there were segregated schools, but he never has offered any complaint about his schooling. He enjoyed it. My mother, on the other hand, grew up in a small town in Kansas. She went to an integrated school, and I think she still considered herself scarred from that experience because the teachers did not treat them equally. So let's not just think that integrated schools means it's a better school. For the most part, for most of them, except for Lucinda Todd, we could not verify their education, which, whether it be right or wrong, we concluded most of them probably did not graduate. They either got to the junior high level, possibly the high school level. Again, at this time, that is not necessarily a red flag. Many people did not progress on to college or so forth. But we do suspect that the business owners went to school up the street at KTI, and if you don't know what KTI was, it's actually it was founded by Blacks as a higher learning institution in Topeka. So it was considered the Tuskegee Institute of the West. And it was in Topeka from 1899 to approximately 1955-56. Can anyone guess why they closed it? I heard things, huh? Desegregation. So yeah, at the time, it was actually an integrated school, and it was supported by the Board of Regents. So the Board of Regents had an option as to what schools they were going to close. Since this was targeting African American students, even though it let other students in, they decided to close it. Versus KU or K-State, which was not percentage-wise as integrated, those schools remained open. All right. So now remember I told you there was a response to segregation. Blacks built their own communities in institutions such as social ones, political ones, spiritual ones, and economic ones. It was in these segregated spaces these women were able to hone their leadership and organizational skills due to Jim Crow. Now, the research team found that they participated in mainstream religious organizations. What does that mean? I mean, if you've ever volunteered for a church function, yeah, you know about recruiting, making sure people show up, organizational skills, fundraising, planning, so forth. All these skills were used to make the Brown case happen. They were able to have those closed meetings and supportive environments when they participated in women's clubs such as Las Senoritas, the Colored Parents Teachers Associating meetings, the NAACP, and there was one even in a sorority. It's because of the neighborhood segregation in Topeka, they were neighbors and their children or grandchildren most likely played together. We also found that there were the family relationships. These women were most likely sitting at holiday tables, and it's through these everyday connections that people like Lucinda Todd and the special committee that the NAACP created to recruit the parents, that's where they most likely made these kind of connections. But the civil rights movement and black women activists were taking shape way before the 1950s. Topeka was the site of many firsts for blacks in Kansas. The first local unit or branch of the NAACP was formed in 1913, and one woman was holding an office as a secretary. The Topeka Council of Colored Women's Clubs was made up of multiple clubs, 3 of which were founded in 1898. In 1900, those clubs joined the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs that was founded in 1896. This umbrella organization advocated for women's rights as well as the uplift and improve the status of African Americans. Its focus was on community service, charitable work, and reform. This including a focus on healthcare, temperance, voting rights, and of course, education and racial inequality. I'm sure it's this backdrop of community support that made these women say yes when Lucinda Todd and others of the special committees recruiting them called upon them. Now, what was their first act of resistance? The women attempted to roll their children into the nearest white school. Now, we don't know the actual stories of these attempts, but when you think about it, the simple act of going to a white person and then being rejected at the door probably made you do one of 2 things. It either made you feel defeated or it motivated them to continue to move forward. So all of these women decided to move forward. I'm sure there were some of the women who had to have more than one serious conversation with their loved ones before signing up as plaintiffs. In addition to signing their names, the majority of them testified at the local trial. Lena Carper was the first to offer testimony along with her daughter, Catherine Carper Sawyer. They testified about things only a mother responsible for their child could testify to. The lawyers asked the women questions about the dangers of their children getting to school, the inconvenience of the busing system, and its long waits, the safety hazard that some of the children experience, the wasted time traveling for far distances to the nearest black school. After the trial, they did have a few encounters with the media. As activists, they also had to take a stand firm in their convictions when the Black community did not always support the case. Though the 12 women plaintiffs were the focus of this research project, I have to mention there are some other women that contributed their activism to this case. So one of them is Lucille Bluford, and I get to claim Lucille because she went to KU, okay, before we get too far. She is actually a newspaper publisher and influential African-American newspaper of the newspaper, the Kansas City Call. She also was the earlier plaintiff in a school segregation herself. As a newspaper woman, Bluford played a vital role in the fight for educational equality. Although based in Kansas City, Missouri, Bluford was a tireless advocate for desegregation, actively supported and reported on lawsuits taking place in Kansas. Now there is also Esther Brown, a resident of Merriam, Kansas. She played a pivotal role in the 1940s lawsuit challenging racial segregation in a small town, often referred to as the white Mrs. Brown to distinguish her from Oliver Brown of the Topeka case. She was instrumental in the fight for educational equality in Kansas. She helped found the NAAC branch in Merriam, and because she promoted those cases, her activities were documented by Lucille Bluford. Lucinda Todd most likely read about them in the Call. Todd said that the Topeka case couldn't have happened without Esther Brown. There's one more. Fayetta Sawyer, a Black woman, lived in Topeka and was considered Lucinda Todd's right-hand woman. The two were known to go door to door gathering signatures for petitions. They also fundraised together. Sawyer and her husband both supported equal opportunities for Black children's education. Both participated in efforts to enroll their children in white schools. And there's one more. She's not associated with Missouri or Kansas, but Polly Murray influenced Marshall's federal strategy. It is based on a college paper that Polly Murray wrote when she was attending Howard University Law School. Now in this paper, she determined the best strategy to desegregate would be a direct attack on Plessy's decision. She and her theory turned out to be correct. So originally at the local level, most of it was about equalization of opportunities and resources. Polly decided to attack Plessy directly. It was that strategy that they used at the national level. When the case was decided in 1954 in Kansas, about 8,000 Black children attended segregated schools. The first-class cities were Kansas City, Topeka, Lawrence, Salina, Atchison, Coffeyville, Fort Scott, Leavenworth, and Parsons. The second and third class cities, those creative cities I was talking about, segregation were Baxter Springs, Bonner Springs, Chitopa, Manhattan, Olathe, Oswego, Paola, and Elwood, which was actually a third class city. While changes didn't happen instantly, these children and all future children's lives would be changed by these women's actions. The women of Brown had influences beyond the court case. By taking these first steps to the white school, they began the process of dismantling Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896 decision, which had codified separate but equal. And they began paving the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, so why would, with this impressive achievement, why would we need a research project to reclaim them? The reason why, we came up with a couple. The reason why they were lost is complex, but bias basically plays a big part in this. First, there's the bias in the media. They were never really asked a lot of questions, but as researchers, we could see their voices slowly fading from the documents over time. There's bias in community memory, also played a part. Not all of the Black community was in favor of the case. Though they didn't speak badly of the case in mixed public spaces, there was concern about the impact on the local Black community, specifically about the Black teachers. Also, there was a need to clean up the image of Kansas. Somewhere, the need to have a local lawsuit and the need for a federal Supreme Court judge to mandate integration have been overshadowed by having, quote, the case of the century that integrated the world, and it happened in that state. We have forgotten the very reason why the case even had to happen. These biases make sure the women, especially Black women, accomplishments were minimized, they were overshadowed by the men involved in the case, and ultimately being close to being erased from the public record. And actually, I have a friend who's a historian, she says, no, I should change that and just say they were erased from the public record. That's not quite true, but it feels that way sometimes. Their tireless work as educators, club women, and mothers sustained the movement's momentum, though their leadership roles were often downplayed. Black women's unwavering determination and fierce commitment to justice should be remembered. Their legacy is a powerful testament to the transformative power of activism. I think she cut me off.
So now we'll take questions for about 15 minutes. And we ask that you step up to the microphones to ask your questions, which of course will end in a question mark. And also I'll be taking questions online too. So if somebody is at home watching on YouTube and has a question, they can type that into the chat area and I'll read that. But does anybody have any questions for Ms. Pearson?
Oh, I see a guy, a gentleman.
Thank you for coming. And this is the first time I've ever heard about the mothers. And like at the 50th anniversary, KTWU in Topeka, they did interviews with the kids. And my real question is, when Linda Brown had her funeral on Topeka Boulevard, they treated her like she was an ex-governor or something with the National Guard, and you know, it was a pompous ceremony.
I was there.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, the question is, I was just making observations.
Yeah,
Will anything ever change?
Yeah, I think it's something to do with the fact that that is the name that you see. They are buried in the et al. Of the case. And so, again, I think part of this research project, when I discovered first Lucinda Todd, it's like, oh, well, she was really active in the NAACP. And then at some point in time, I had to look at a list. I had to look at the court documents. And I was like, well, wait a minute, y'all. What do you mean there was 12 Black women also involved in this? Most of us just think it was Oliver Brown and no more. So then discovering them, and at some point, I was like, I have to tell their story. I have to research them. Even if it's just for this 70th anniversary, hopefully, as the research project, we will take our documents and put them on repository in two different archives. So at least we've got the next person has a jump start on learning more about them. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I did experience segregation in integrated schools, and I do know that Brown versus the Board of Education started the ball rolling. I don't know, I came from a small town in Missouri, so I don't know who was involved. So my question is, aside from signing on to be a part of this, what kinds of things did the women have to do? What kind of activities did they have to be involved in? And the second part of the question, was there fear and threats involved in that? Because logically, to me, there would be.
From what I've discovered, If Lucinda Todd was mainly the person who did the most activities, and she had to fundraise, she did petitions. She was the secretary of the NAACP at that time, so she was also helping with correspondence. They had meetings at her house as well, and I understand when they had meetings, they would draw down the blinds so nobody could see what was coming on, which kind of leads me to the answer of your second question. I've heard mixed results. I know in Lucinda Todd's, that's part of the problem, is we don't have a collection of papers from every single woman. We do have one from Lucinda, and she did receive threatening mail her entire life. And so I've heard from another, as this project becomes more well known, I'm hearing from descendants from them related to the women. And there are some, talked to a descendant that says, yes, part of the reason why that particular woman went quiet is because they were getting threats of different kinds. So I have no way to substantiate that. So. But yes, we understand that some of them might have felt threatened after signing on to the case. Yes, ma'am.
You alluded to, and I've read in other places, about the fact that a case in Merriam sort of broke the ground or set the stage for the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education case. Can you elaborate on that at all? Because it's, in my mind, not well.
I'm not sure. I would say that Merriam broke the ground for the Brown case. Remember, there was almost 17 cases even before Brown. So I think all of them chipped away at segregation in Kansas. The Esther Brown case, her case was unique in that it was a white woman leading the charge in that city. And so she is the one that founded the NAACP there. I understand her story to be is that she was an activist in and of herself and I don't remember the reason why she was visiting a black school, but she visited the black school there and was appalled at the conditions, and then started moving forward with desegregation activities and led the charge in. Much like Lucinda Todd did in Topeka, she raised money and was an advocate for the case. So, but I think we forget about all the cases that started happening. The very first case happened, almost immediately after the permissive segregation law was put into place, within the first couple of years, so.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
And thank you so much for this contribution. My name is Sahai, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Maryland College Park, and I moved to the Midwest to take care of family. This is the first time I've learned of these women. So thank you for giving voice and also vision, right? To see their narratives, to take the time to tell their stories, really, really key, right? So I'll give you a little context around my research because I feel like there's this wonderful intersection and opportunity for me as a researcher, right? To learn about Black women's giving, and that's kind of what I study, essentially the idea of philanthropy, but everyday philanthropy. So your conversation around the social networks, the ways in which these women knew each other and their connection to their church communities, for example, their sororal communities, really, really key, right? And my argument is that Black women have been at the center of social and political change since time immemorial, right? And their giving is a really big part of that. So I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about that. And then I have a second question, and that's related to those optional states, right, around segregation who chose not to segregate, and what your theories of change around that were, because you mentioned that at the beginning, and I'm just curious, so thank you.
I will take the optional states. I believe in the just one too many theory. So remember, we put the permissive segregation law on the books right about the time of the Exodus. So before that, the population of Blacks in Kansas was small. It was minimal. All of a sudden, you have 40,000 people flooding through your state, in your state. About 3,000 of them stayed in Topeka. So it was a matter of, oh, wait a minute. Okay, we need to create some separation of space. Is part of the reason Kansas actually was populated by 3 different groups, and two of them one was against slavery. The other one was against the economic benefit that slavery provided people. So when you move further west, I believe there weren't as many blacks, first off. So you didn't have to worry about those rules as much about creating space between the two of them. And the economic advantage was not there either to have a separate. So your first question about networks is a long one, and we will trade cards or do something, okay? Yes, sir.
Hi, you mentioned that the black community at the time wasn't all in favor of this initiative, and that rings true in any initiative that you talk about because the black community is not a monolith. So I want you, my question is, can you expand on what some of the arguments against it were at the time? And I want to kind of compare them to the arguments now, because there's a theory that that desegregation hurt the black community, because when you look at public education now, we're still hyper-segregated. You look at the public schools, KCKPS just failed their bond. KCPS has a bond up next year, but they haven't passed the bond in 60 years. And the last time they got funding was because of a desegregation case. So just trying to understand, were some of the same thoughts then what we're thinking about now, and how can we learn from that?
Yeah, how can we learn from that? That's a deep question. Yes, part of the reason why Topeka had even though there was only 4 black schools, they were characterized as good schools. So unlike in the South, you didn't see schools in disrepair. I do believe they did have some books that weren't necessarily new, but there was a woman named Mamie Williams. She was a doctor, and she created the curriculum specifically for the black schools. So the teachers were considered to be as trained as white teachers, and in some cases even trained even better than the white teachers. So what the argument is the black community felt like it was an attack on their black schools, and that their black teachers were going to be hurt by this. You have mixed results as to how much damage it was. Why, part of the reason why people ask about or say, did desegregation help or hurt, is because of that community network, that bonding. When you're in a community, you know who your teachers are. They're living right up the street from you, right? They're going to church with you. They understand your cultural needs. And so, yes, in that regard, I can see an argument that is being made today for that desegregation was not necessarily the best thing that happened to us. That is, again, one of those longer discussions that I would be happy to have with you, but because she's very patiently waiting, and you're going to stop me any minute now. Yes, ma'am. Or whichever one is first.
So my question is, how is the Brown, which is the gentleman, why was he the lead face on this instead of the 12 women or any of the 12 women? And how did Thurgood Marshall interact with these women who are the et al. In this case?
Well, Thurgood Marshall did not argue the local case. So there were local lawyers doing that. So Thurgood Marshall only argued at the Supreme Court level, and there you don't bring the plaintiffs up to discuss. There are a couple of different theories as to why. The first theory, that is the one that runs pretty rampant, is just because he was a guy. That's it. You know, basically he was just a guy. Now, a second theory, in the book, A Girl Stands at the Door, she makes the case that makes sense to me, in that at this time, as it was stated before, this was becoming a women's movement in education. And the NAACP is like, whoa, wait a minute, we need some guys in here. And so there were some guys involved in different cases, but at this point in time, they were really actively looking for at least one man to be involved in the cases. So they asked him very specifically. He was a minister, had a job at the railroad, he was upstanding. When you speak to people who are involved in the case, they're not sure that he necessarily wanted to be involved, but he did sign up for it and he did testify at the trial. So
you're saying that the women had actually initiated this case.
Lucinda Todd,
and
yeah.
then when it became a national, so at what point did it get to the Supreme Court that they're looking for a face? And Thurgood Marshall takes us up.
He was on the plaintiff's list even at the local case. So even at the local level, they were making arguments that there should be more men involved. So, yeah, anyway.
We'll take this last question, and then I have one from someone watching at home also.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. First off, kudos to you and your research team, and gratitude for bringing this to light, because I shared this with a bunch of people in my work network, and they're all like, please go and attend and tell me all the things. So thank you for bringing this. My question is, you hit on a little bit about that there were really good Black schools with Black teachers, and there was this potential opposition. Were the women, the mothers, was there also an interest or a focus in helping the teachers be involved in those schools? Was there any collaboration that you saw from the research that you guys have done, that the 12 women also like, hey, it's not just for our children, it is for the other women in our community that can also bring value to the education system? Did you see any about that? And if so, could you talk about that?
No, because you have to remember at the local level, it was about equalization of resources. So in Topeka, the 4 schools were located in 4 separate parts of the city. So literally a child could be walking, that thing you hear about, people walking past a white school to get to a Black school. For instance, Linda Brown actually had to walk almost a mile down some railroad tracks and then hop a bus and ride another mile. That eats up time versus the white school that was nearest to her was about 4 blocks away. So just that amount of time spending. So when you consider you're sending little children out to make it to a bus stop or hope that the bus shows up because there wasn't the investment that needed to happen in terms of buses. There was, again, the Black community did not see a problem and supported their Black schools and their Black teachers. They wanted to be able to say, so for instance, is part of the reason why Lucinda Todd got angry initially is there was an all-district music concert, right? And her daughter Nancy was supposed to, played an instrument. There's 22 schools, but only 18 were invited. And Lucinda Todd got hold of that, and she's like, wait a minute, why isn't my daughter's school being a part of this? So there was lots of little things like that happened, that they were being denied resources that the white children were getting, so.
Thank you.
All right, just one more from home. Somebody noticed about how you don't have photos for all of the women and wants to hear about the challenges you faced finding those photos.
Yeah, that was we change our names when we get married, right? So again, I look at other cases and I'm like, oh, look at all the lovely group photos that happened. That did not happen in Topeka. I don't know why. There's just one that happened later on in time, why they didn't show up. So since people were not asking them questions and not documenting their history, there's this weird rule sometimes historians bring up, oh, we need to wait 50 years to figure out the significance of the event, right? I am very happy that Cheryl Brown Henderson did not wait 50 years, that she started on this project beforehand. She got some oral histories, but as you heard in their bios, some of them started dying early. Some of them did not have descendants that we could get a hold of. So researching them was, some of them were very easy. You know, we found their obituaries, we could track them. Other ones, they changed their names, they moved, they did lots of things. So it was really hard to pin them down. So that was just some of the challenges. But the main challenge is the fact that they were women and they moved around.
Thank you very much, Donna Rae Pearson, and thank you all for being here tonight.
Can I take a picture of them real quick? Y'all mind sitting for a picture real quick? Or standing for a picture real quick? And then I'll let you go.